All right, good morning, everyone. We'll go ahead and get started with class in just a moment here. As usual, there's a handout in the back, so if you haven't had a chance to pick that up yet, you might want to go ahead and do so. And please remember to sign in for class either now or before you leave today. So, we've turned a corner in the class at this point, and for the last 3 weeks, we've talked in some detail about Jesus' crucifixion, and at this point, we'll begin talking about the resurrection for the next 3 weeks. And so today, in particular, the topic of the lesson will be what did people in the ancient world believe about resurrection? What did people in the ancient world think about the idea of someone rising from the dead? And as we'll see, the answer to this question, how we answer this question, plays into what we'll talk about next week in more detail, which is arguments for the resurrection. And we'll look also at some of the alternative explanations that people have put forward over the centuries and why they fall short. And then finally, on Palm Sunday, the last week of this class, we'll talk about the meaning of the resurrection. So let me go ahead and pray for us, and then we'll get started with today's lesson. Father, we thank you for the opportunity that we have to gather together and to talk about things as glorious as the resurrection of your Son from the dead. And we are reminded that is why we're here, because you did indeed raise him from the dead. And so as we study these things together, we ask that you would take what we talk about here and what we learn here to bolster our faith so that we may follow you with even greater confidence. And we pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so I've provided to begin with a brief overview of how today's lesson will go. And as I said, the question that I really want to look at is what did ancient people believe about resurrection? And I could make this lesson really fast. I can say this in just a couple sentences. They didn't, basically. Ancient people did not think that it was possible for a person to be raised from the dead. And so if you're talking about Greeks and Romans, they found the idea of resurrection to be preposterous. And if you're talking about Jews were the one group of people in the ancient world that did believe in resurrection, except that they believed in the resurrection of all people, a general resurrection of all people at the end of history, not the resurrection of one person in the middle of history. So if you're asking the question, who in the ancient world believed that it was possible for an individual person to be raised from the dead in the middle of history, the answer is no one. And no one, as far as any of our sources tell us. And occasionally, and this has been said before and argued by many people, but occasionally someone will try to contradict that. But as we'll see in a little bit here, the examples that people sometimes turn to as objections to this rule are not really good examples. They're not really talking about resurrection. And finally, we'll look today at the fact that the New Testament supports this understanding. And then why does this matter? Why does it matter that no one in the ancient world really believed that it was possible for a person to be raised from the dead? Well, it matters because several of the arguments that have been used to try to discount Jesus' resurrection over the years actually depend on the assumption that people in the ancient world did think that it was possible for someone to be raised from the dead. So once we realize that people in the ancient world didn't believe that, then several of these arguments, things like Well, the fact that they were just, they were pre-scientific people and they thought this kind of thing was possible, well, no, according to the sources, they did not. Or, it was just wish fulfillment. This was an idea that they had in their heads already, and they just wanted it to be true so bad that they convinced themselves that it was. That also doesn't work because, in fact, they didn't have the idea in their heads. And there are various types of psychological explanations. I'll talk a little bit more about some of those next week. But in one way or another, these psychological explanations also depend on them having a prior concept of the resurrection, of a person being bodily raised from the dead already in their minds. And so all of these alternative explanations actually fall apart once we see that now there are other alternative arguments that I'll talk about next week, but several of them, several different types of alternative explanations for the resurrection fall apart once we realize that people in the ancient world did not believe that it was possible for a person to be raised from the dead any more than anyone today typically would. So that's where we're going. An important thing to start with, though, as we have this discussion, is a definition of resurrection. What are we talking about? It's important if we're going to say nobody believed this was possible, it's important to define exactly what it is that they didn't think was possible. And so when we talk about resurrection, this is what Jews across the board seem to have meant by resurrection. This is what we find supported in the New Testament when people are talking about resurrection. What we're talking about is a return to bodily existence in the same body and to this worldly life after death. So bodily existence in the same body and this worldly life after death, a return to those things. And so this is distinct from ideas of immortality of the soul. Not that immortality of the soul and resurrection are mutually exclusive ideas, but they're not the same thing. To talk about resurrection is not just to talk about the immortality of the soul. It's not to talk about going to heaven or going to hell, for that matter. It's not to talk about ghosts. None of these things. Simply, some sort of existence after death is not what we're talking about when we talk about resurrection. Resurrection is very specific. Being raised, being returned to bodily existence in the same body being raised to new life, and a return to this worldly life after death. And so when we get that specific with it, that's what you find, that nobody in the ancient world thought was possible, at least with an individual in the middle of history. So what do we find? If you're looking at the pagan world, and I'll concentrate especially on Greeks and Romans here, because that's the pagan world that was contemporary in the time of the New Testament. But you could really take this beyond Greeks and Romans. You can go all the way back to ancient Egypt or virtually any civilization you want. But first of all, to begin with, Greeks and Romans are pretty much unanimous that the dead don't rise, period. So, Nathaniel, if you'll go to the first slide there. This is a quote from Homer's Iliad. This is actually Priam lamenting the death of his son Hector after Achilles has killed him. But Priam says this: you must endure and not be brokenhearted. Lamenting for your son will do no good at all. You will be dead yourself before you can bring him back. The idea there, you will be dead yourself before you bring him back. In other words, there's no bringing somebody back from the dead. You can't do it. Another quote that's even more clear on the next slide. Aeschylus from Eumenides. Once a man has died and the dust has soaked up his blood, there is no resurrection. That one can't be a whole lot more clear. And by the way, both of those passages are using the same word. The word for bring him back is a variation on the word used for resurrection in the New Testament in the Iliad. Aeschylus, when he says resurrection here, is using the exact same word that the New Testament uses to refer to Jesus' resurrection. So this is very clear, and these two statements, while they're only two, are representative. We find the same kind of thinking echoed throughout all sorts of different sources, whether you're talking about Greek sources, Roman sources. Over a period of centuries, you find the same kind of thinking echoed again and again, and even in Greek mythology. Apollo is disciplined by Zeus at one point for trying, for even thinking about bringing somebody back from the dead. So even in their mythology, you see the idea ridiculed that any such thing could ever be done. Even the gods, according to the Greeks, cannot do this. They're not permitted. So that's the first point. Across the board, they're pretty clear that there's no such thing as resurrection. So what did they think? I've cataloged a few different ideas about post-mortem existence that we see among Greeks and Romans. So the first possibility, there were some, such as the Epicureans especially, who denied that there was any existence at all after death. Death was simply the end of existence. If we go to the next slide, there's a common epitaph that was found on graves in the ancient world, or on tombs all over the place, that goes like this: I wasn't, I was, I am not, I don't care. In other words, I don't exist anymore. I don't care because I'm not here anymore. And this was found in both, versions of this were found in both Latin and Greek inscriptions of this kind on tombs throughout the ancient world, again, over a period of centuries. So this was a very common thought to express. I wasn't, I was, I am not, I don't care. They can even be flippant about it. And so that's the Epicureans, and we could also put, if we were to look at the Roman writer Pliny, who's after the time of Jesus, but not long after. We see him ridiculing all the different groups of people out there who believe that any kind of existence after death is possible, and he's just mocking them all. So we had people who thought that. On the other hand, Homer had the idea, and not just Homer, but Homer speaks for a good part of the ancient world when he envisions disembodied souls going down to the underworld, to Hades, which is sort of, it's not the equivalent of hell necessarily, but it is sort of a gloomy existence, just wandering in the underworld for eternity. And so there you have a belief in an immortal soul, but certainly death is something that one does not come back from. And maybe the most dominant view in the first century, though, was a view inherited from Platonism, and was the view of Stoicism as well. Stoicism was probably the most popular religious philosophy in ancient Rome in the time of the New Testament. And this would be the view that souls upon death are released from prison. The body is basically the prison of the soul, and the soul is released from it upon death. So Cicero, I have a representative quote from Cicero here, from the Dream of Scipio. Cicero says, "Those we think dead are alive and have escaped from the chain of their bodies as if from a prison. For this thing you call life is in fact death." So for Cicero, who articulates a typical Stoic point of view, our current existence in bodily form is actually death, and the real life comes when you're freed from this body. And so if you take that view, which again is probably the most common and dominant view in the first century, in the pagan world, if you take that view, then not only is resurrection not a thing, not possible, it's also undesirable. Why would you want to come back in a body? Why would you want to have a body or come back to this world? Another view that we find, particularly with the Roman emperors, this wouldn't be a common view for most people, but or a common expectation for most people, but there was a view that some people might become gods upon death. So Julius Caesar was deified upon death and was said to have become a god. Other Roman emperors were said to have become a god. Vespasian, reportedly, his final words were, "I think I'm becoming a god." So that was an idea that we see with the Roman emperors, and perhaps there were others who thought it too, but it was probably not a common belief for the common person. And regardless, it has nothing to do with coming back to bodily existence in this world. Reincarnation. Reincarnation is something that we see in the ancient world, but surprisingly, it's an unpopular idea in the ancient world. It's ridiculed. Most of the time when people in the ancient world talk about reincarnation, they mock it and they ridicule it as a really silly idea. But you do have a few here and there who argue for it. Pythagoras was perhaps the first in history that we know of to argue this, but he didn't have many takers. There weren't that many who followed after him in that. And you had, let's see, who was it? The Emperor Commodus believed that he was Hercules reborn. Now, whether or not he actually believed that or that was just rhetoric that he used and to bolster himself and his image, who knows? But he said it anyway. Still, overall, not a common idea, not a popular idea in the ancient world. Spirits and ghosts. The interesting thing here is that ancient people had no problem believing in spirits or ghosts, or the possibility that a ghost, the spirit of a deceased person, might appear to you, but they never, ever described that as a person being raised from the dead. Nobody ever saw a ghost and said, so-and-so has been raised from the dead. They called it a ghost. And there's a whole different set of vocabulary for that than for the vocabulary associated with resurrection. And so that eliminates any possibility of confusion of those ideas. Ancient people knew the difference between a ghost and a person being returned to bodily existence very well, and differentiated that very well. Returning from the underworld in mythology. So there are some stories in Greco-Roman mythology and Greek myths in particular of people making journeys to the underworld and coming back. Does that count as resurrection? Not really. First of all, they didn't use the vocabulary of resurrection when describing those journeys to the underworld and back. And the thing is that even in mythology, people who made those journeys would die again. So this wasn't some sort of permanent defeat of death. So even in mythology, you don't really find the idea of resurrection, and even if one did, it seems that most people didn't really believe that such a thing was possible anyway. One of the most common objections that people will try to, you'll sometimes hear, one of the most common objections against the idea that no one else was thinking about resurrection or believed it possible in the ancient world comes from ancient Egypt. And it is true that with mummification, the purpose of mummification, of the whole ritual, was to facilitate bodily existence after death. there was a belief that the Egyptians had of the soul being reunited with the corpse after death. But from there it gets really strange, and it's definitely not what we're talking about with resurrection, because rather than saying the soul is reunited with the body after death, for the Egyptians, what you should really say is the soul is reunited with the body in death, and death becomes your new bodily existence. You're not coming back to this world in bodily form. Instead, you will have a bodily existence in death, wherever and whatever that is, but it won't be here, and your body is not going to be raised in the way that we're talking about with resurrection. Lastly, for a couple centuries at least, people have talked about the phenomenon of dying and rising gods that show up in mythology from different parts of the world. You can find it in Norse mythology, you can find it in ancient Canaanite mythology, including the god Baal that the Israelites struggled with at times. And so some people have even tried to say this is where the whole idea of resurrection comes from. There are various reasons why that's unlikely. I won't go into all of them right now, but I will just say that if you want to talk about the myths of the dying and rising gods that we find in different parts of the world, these are almost always what we call weather gods, and they're gods that are associated with the seasons. And so the idea was that this particular god, Baal, was a fertility god, so to speak, and so everything blooms in the springtime. That's when things grow, and of course in the winter everything dies. And so the mythological idea was that Baal dies in the winter, and he comes back in the spring, and does this every year, again and again, in a repeated cycle. And that's the kind of thing that you see. The pattern that you see with all the dying and rising gods in different mythologies. And so there are several differences there with what we're talking about with resurrection. Number one, it was limited to gods. It was something that a particular god, a cycle that a particular god went through. It was not something that anybody was saying happened with human beings at all. And secondly, it was really a way of explaining the patterns of the seasons. Thirdly, it's a repeated cycle that happens annually, whereas resurrection is an overcoming of death that happens once and for all. And so you're really not talking about the same thing. And even if you were, it's something that's plainly limited to the gods and not something that was ever believed to take place with human beings. And so we can summarize at that point and say, and basically what we can say is that pagans did not believe that resurrection was possible, or in many cases even desirable. And so they would have regarded the idea typically as nonsense. And so one will sometimes hear the ancient people here. This is probably the most uncritical of all objections to resurrection, to Jesus' resurrection, but one will sometimes hear the ancient people, being pre-critical people, pre-scientific people, simply believed silly things and believed that things like somebody coming back from the dead was possible. Well, no, they did not. We don't see that anywhere. We have zero evidence of that. What we have is a whole lot of people saying that the idea is ridiculous, and ridiculing the idea left and right. As we'll see in a little bit, there's evidence in the New Testament that reflects that. So that's the first point. But what about Jews? Certainly Jewish people believed in resurrection, right? And well, yes, they did. Without a doubt, Jewish people were probably, the Jews were probably the one group of people that did believe in resurrection in the ancient world. But again, the belief was a belief in a general resurrection of the dead at the end of history. It would be one of the final acts of God associated with final judgment at the end of history. From what we can tell, probably most Jews at the time of Jesus held this belief. Not all, but most. So, for instance, we know that the Pharisees adamantly believed in resurrection, as did the Essenes, which would be the group that was creating the Dead Sea Scrolls over in Qumran. And the Sadducees, on the other hand, who, by the way, accounted for the priesthood in the time of Jesus, did not believe in the resurrection. So not all Jews in the time of Jesus believed in the resurrection of the dead, but probably most did. The Sadducees were a minority group anyway. But again, it was a belief in a general resurrection of the dead at the end of history. This belief can already be found in the Old Testament when we get into some of the prophetic books in particular. So Isaiah 26:19, I'll show that one. Isaiah 26:19 reads, "Your dead shall live, their bodies shall rise. You who dwell in the dust, awake and sing for joy, for your dew is a dew of light, and the earth will give birth to the dead." It's a vivid image, and clearly we're talking about bodily existence here. That couldn't be more plain. And we even have an image of them coming up out of the earth. So we really are talking about this body being raised to new life and a return to this worldly existence. Ezekiel 37 is one of the most famous passages that it begins to articulate this idea of resurrection in the Old Testament, and the whole chapter is worth reading in that regard, but I'll just highlight verses 5 and 6. Thus says the Lord God to these bones, "Behold, I will cause breath to enter you, and you shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will cause flesh to come upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you, and you shall live, and you shall know that I am the Lord." Again, it could not be more plain there that we're talking about return to bodily existence and bodily life. Daniel 12:2, 12:1 through 3, but I'll highlight verse 2, is a very important passage. Daniel 12:2 reads, "And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt." So there's a resurrection of both the righteous and the unrighteous. The righteous are resurrected to everlasting life, and the unrighteous are seemingly resurrected for judgment, and that's it, for final judgment. But both will be raised at the end of history. And that was the typical Jewish belief. And so I won't go through them, but what we would find if we looked at the intertestamental literature, Jewish literature between the Old and New Testament, is that this picture is reinforced again and again. What we see here in these texts in the Old Testament is simply reinforced, becomes more pronounced, more developed, but nothing essential changes. It's a belief in a return to bodily existence that will happen at the end of history. Otherwise, what we see in the Old Testament is that death is quite final. Death is spoken of as a land from which there is no return in a lot of texts. Probably I've noted a good number of them there, but Job maybe gives us the most poignant expressions in this regard. And so we'll look at Job 7:7 for a minute. In Job 7:7, Job says, "Remember that my life is a breath, my eye will never again see good." So there is a belief in the finality of death here. But when we go on a little bit further in Job, we have a fascinating passage that could be described as perhaps one of the earliest expressions of hope for something like resurrection that we see. So Job 19:25 through 27 reads, "For I know that my Redeemer lives, and at the last he will stand upon the earth. And after my skin has been thus destroyed, yet in my flesh I shall see God, whom I shall see for myself, and my eyes shall behold, and not another. My heart faints within me." And so that idea there of after my skin has been destroyed, in my flesh I shall see God. Commentators have been all over this verse these verses for centuries, and there are a lot of interpretive questions that come up surrounding them. But most agree at this point that Job seems to be imagining re-embodied existence here. That's what it sounds like, and so what we see, but what we see there, even there, is that when does this happen? When might this return to bodily existence happen? Well, the Redeemer will accomplish it, and is the first thing that he says. And secondly, at the last, when the Redeemer stands upon the earth, that's when this will happen. So again, this is something that is final at the end of time, at the end of history, and there's no reason to think that Job is therefore imagining this happening to him and him alone, but it probably corresponds rather to that Jewish belief in a general resurrection of the dead at the end of history. So that belief, as I said, remains consistent. And now we can sum it up and say that if you're talking about the ancient world and you're talking about Greeks and Romans, if you're talking about basically anybody in the ancient world besides the Jews, resurrection is impossible, it's silly, and it's undesirable for most. If you're talking about the Jewish people, yes, they believe that a general resurrection of the dead will happen at the end of time, but they're certainly not expecting any individual to be raised from the dead in the middle of history. And by the way, for as many messianic texts as we have in Judaism, none of them are expecting the Messiah to be raised from the dead either. First of all, they're not expecting him to die, so that precludes resurrection. So that's what we find. And what I'd like to do now is just look at some evidence in the New Testament that actually strongly supports that picture. We can actually see evidence in the New Testament all over the place. The ancient people did not actually believe that resurrection was possible. So I'll start in Mark 9 through 10, and I have, 7 points, or 8 points here. 8 different kinds of evidence in the New Testament that the ancient people, in fact, did not believe in resurrection, including Jesus' disciples. So number 1, Mark 9 through 10. What we see here is that the disciples apparently do not understand Jesus' own predictions of his resurrection. And as they were coming down the mountain, this is right after the Transfiguration, and as they were coming down the mountain, he charged them to tell no one what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept the matter to themselves, questioning what this rising from the dead might mean. In other words, he's just told them that he's going to be crucified and then 3 days later raised from the dead, and they're questioning, what in the world is he talking about? And no doubt by this time they've gotten used to the fact that their teacher sometimes speaks in figures of speech, and they probably think that that's what he's doing here as well. But they're debating with one another. The word questioning there could also be translated debating, but they're questioning or debating what he is talking about, because surely he can't mean that literally. It seems that that's probably really the case, that they did not understand that he meant this literally, because when we get to the resurrection narratives themselves in the Gospels, we see more evidence to that effect. So we'll go to Mark 16:1. One of the things that we see here, Mark 16:1, when the Sabbath was passed, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices. Oh, that should have been brought, not bought, but brought spices so that they might go and anoint him. Okay, so they show up at Jesus' tomb with spices to anoint him, and let's just think about this for a second. You don't come to anoint a body that's not there. You come to anoint a decomposing corpse. That's what they're expecting to find when they come to the tomb. Luke gives us the same picture. So his own mother, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, that would be Jesus' mother, and Mary Magdalene, who was with him a great deal, they are not expecting him to be raised from the dead. They are expecting him to be in his tomb. Further, we see that all of Jesus' followers actually are initially taken by surprise or perplexed. They're certainly not expecting his resurrection. So if we go to John 21 through 2, we read, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. So she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, and said to them, 'They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him.'" Her first reaction here is not to say, "Oh my gosh, he's been raised from the dead." It's to say, somebody moved his body, somebody took his body. And so we see here that actually Mary's probably thinking very much like we would think. Her gut reaction, her gut instinct is not to say, "We've had a resurrection here." It's to say, somebody took his body. And we see other reactions to that effect in several other places, and in John and Luke and in Mark as well. When we get to Luke 24:6, an angel, Luke tells us in 24:6 that an angel actually had to remind them of what Jesus said, reminds them that he predicted his resurrection as well as his death. And so you can see how this is working here. He had predicted it, but obviously they didn't understand it because none of them were actually expecting it. They must not have thought that he was speaking literally, or something like that. And so an angel has to remind them, remember what he said. He told you this would happen. They have to be reminded. They don't think of it on their own because it's such an unexpected thing, so far outside the realm of expectations. Even then, it turns out the disciples do not, most of the disciples don't actually believe the women. When the women find this, they come back and tell the disciples, and the disciples don't believe it. So Luke 24:11, "But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." And now you have to think, too, that for the Gospels to be recording this doesn't really make the disciples look good right here. At best, they look obtuse, but nevertheless, this is what we have recorded in a number of different places in both Luke and in John. The disciples' initial reaction, the people who had followed Jesus for all this time and had heard him make these predictions, nevertheless do not believe it when they hear that it's happened. Not initially. Thomas in John 24:25. Another example of this. Now Thomas, one of the 12, called the twin, was not with them when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We have seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the mark of the nails, and place my finger into the mark of the nails, and place my hand into his side, I will never believe." Again, clear case of disciples not initially believing. If we look at Luke 24:19 through 24, I've just put part of that up on the screen here, but this is part of the Emmaus Road story in Luke, and so we have two disciples walking down the road who are met by the risen Jesus himself. They don't recognize him, and They begin to explain to the risen Jesus what has happened, very ironically. And and at the moment, Jesus is playing dumb, pretending that he doesn't know. Um, but, uh, but, but they say this, we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things happened. Moreover, some women of our company amazed us. They were at the tomb early in the morning, and when they did not find his body, they came back saying that they had even seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but him they did not see. And so they're perplexed. They don't know what to think at this point, but they're just amazed. They seem actually grieved by the whole situation. And I could go on, and there are a few other texts we could look at that I've noted on the handout, but one last one that I want to look at is Acts 17:32. So this comes from Paul's sermon at the Areopagus in Athens, and so his famous sermon on Mars Hill, as it's called. And at the conclusion of it, when he begins to talk about the resurrection, this is what we read. Now, when they heard of the resurrection of the dead, some mocked, but others said, we will hear you again about this. So some mocked, exactly the kind of reaction that we find all throughout our sources toward resurrection in the ancient world. So to sum up the evidence that we see in the New Testament, we could say this: inasmuch as individual resurrection was not a known concept in the ancient world, it seems that not even Jesus' own disciples failed to understand that when he foretold his resurrection, he meant it literally. And so here's why it matters. Many, again, have tried to explain away the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection as either they were pre-scientific simpletons who simply thought this kind of thing could happen, apparently not, or they've tried to explain it in psychological terms as something like wish fulfillment or an extreme response to grief. And I'll say a little bit more about those ideas next week. But the thing is, all of these sorts of explanations depend on a group of people who already had such an expectation in mind, or at least the possibility in mind beforehand. But it turns out that all such evidence as we have from the ancient world points to the fact that nobody was thinking that, and the evidence of the New Testament itself betrays the fact that not even the disciples were expecting that, even having heard it from Jesus himself. It was so far outside the realm of possibilities to them, it seems, that they must have understood his predictions in some sort of figurative sense, and it took an empty tomb and actually meeting him risen in person to get them to really believe it. And so to get down to it, ultimately, the claim that an individual was raised from the dead is unknown in history before Jesus. Of all the things that people claimed about other people, whether it was Alexander the Great or the Caesars, anyone, they claimed some wild things. They may have claimed that they became gods. That's an easier claim to make because nobody can really substantiate it. Nobody can deny it either. Nobody ever claimed that somebody was raised from the dead, not that we have record of. If somebody ever said it, it failed to make the pages of history, which says something in and of itself. There must not have been too many takers. And and so the fact is, this is it's an extraordinary claim to make. It's a near impossible claim to make about a person. So it's not surprising that nobody claimed this about somebody that we have record of before Jesus. But here they do quite clearly make that claim. The claim that most people in the ancient world were saying was impossible. And what we know is that from there, unexpectedly, a religion that, a faith that now numbers in the billions, was launched. And so that demands quite an explanation, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next week. Yeah, okay, I'll take a couple questions. I probably shouldn't because of time, but I will. What about Lazarus? That's a great question. So scholars usually put Lazarus, it's true, Lazarus is raised from the dead. It just is. And Jesus even says shortly before he does it, I am the resurrection and the life. So there's got to be some sort of connection with resurrection there. But scholars will usually, and I think rightly, put that in a slightly different category because when the New Testament talks about resurrection bodies, especially in 1 Corinthians 15, talks about these bodies as being glorified somehow, and while it's the same body, it's also changed. It's also transformed into something far more glorious than it presently is. And Jesus' resurrection body seems to display, and I'll talk about some of this in future lessons, display different qualities as well as some type of transformation. And then the big thing is that resurrection, in the case of Jesus, Paul is very clear, Jesus having died and been raised will never die again. Death no longer has power over him. So resurrection was thought of as something that was final, a true overcoming of death once and for all. Whereas with Lazarus, it seems, the text never comes right out and says it, but it seems that Lazarus was going to die again, and undoubtedly did. Otherwise, it's a very good question where he's at. And there are a couple other people in the New Testament that are said to be raised from the dead, and we would probably have to say something similar about them. So you could see in Lazarus, I think, a foreshadowing of the resurrection. And the power of life that Jesus has, and that he will ultimately open up to all who have faith in him through his own resurrection. But it has to go into a different category because it is not a final, once and for all overcoming of death. So scholars will typically use the term resuscitation to describe that. It may not be the best term. Resuscitation is kind of a weird term for somebody who's been dead for a number of days. But whatever we want to call it, it seems that it does somehow have to be distinguished from what happens with Jesus and his resurrection. Yeah. So, yeah, and here's the thing. I do think that the fact that Jesus was saying things about resurrection plays into why they came to believe that he was raised from the dead. I mean, you have three things going on there. He predicted it. The tomb was empty. They saw him. And all three of those things probably play a part. But it also seems that we have some evidence here that the first one, the fact that he predicted it, the fact that he had talked about resurrection, and seemingly even, they saw somebody raised from the dead. Seemingly from the resurrection narratives themselves, none of that was enough to prompt them initially to say he's been raised from the dead. They were going to have to see it for themselves first. Good question. All right, now I do have to, my wife is pointing to the clock in the back, and so I do have to go ahead and finish here. But we'll talk more about it next week. Thank you all.